Hey, I thought this would be a fun discussion video to have because I know that a lot of people are looking at this new shiny skill and are thinking to slap it on some other units other than Legendary Caeda, because I think the common consensus going around with Legendary Caeda is that she's not the best when it comes to anything. Maybe popping cavalry and armors, but beyond that, there is a lot to be desired with her. So I think a lot of people are looking more at her like brand new distant counter skill more than anything else, but that's aside the point. Today I wanted to talk about the practical applications of the skill because I know a lot of people are going to be polling for it. So basically I wanted to go over several units that I believe benefit from this skill the most. And honestly, while it's a bigger list than you would get from something like Distant Pressure where the speed kind of only works on like specific units, the additional attack with chip damage actually does benefit a lot more units, albeit to a certain extent, because at the end of the day, the chip damage is not always the most desired. But even so, I do believe that there are plenty of units that you can take advantage of that I believe can make use of this skill fairly well. But yeah, no more intro, let's just talk about the skill itself first. Basically, it is an enemy phase oriented skill because distant counter in itself is enemy phase oriented. However, the attack boost does apply in both phases as long as you are able to land an attack. However, because it is a distant counter skill, chances are you're really going to be using this in the enemy phase more than the player phase, and if you are looking for a player phase skill that grants attack, you're better off with something else entirely. So that being said, what kind of units can really take advantage of this skill in the enemy phase? After narrowing down a bunch of units, I believe there's only 3 kinds of roles in the enemy phase that specific units can take advantage of. That being the dual phase Brave niche, you have units with sustain, and you have units that rely on one-hit KOs. I think it's also worth noting that because of the chip damage, a lot of the time you're going to either be running Vantage so you can get your attacks out first, or you have some kind of sustain present in your weapon or in your kit somewhere. And because of that, it definitely limits how many units can effectively make use of this skill. So getting straight into it, as far as I'm concerned, the best units that can take advantage of the skill the most are the dual phase Brave units. So units like Valentine Pala, Laszlo, Caeda, I'll go in more depth with other ones in a second, but units that can attack twice in the enemy phase are essentially getting a 10-point attack stat swing. Now, it's also important to note that a lot of these units that function in the enemy phase, especially with Vantage, are relying on either one-hit KOs or two-hit KOs. So because of the fact that Distant Storm grants +5 attack per hit up to the unit as long as they meet the condition, then they're essentially getting 10 more attack because they're basically able to attack twice before the foe can counter, which is why I believe the dual phase Brave units absolutely have the edge when it comes to this skill. So for example, when it comes to someone like Caeda or Laszlo, they can run Steady Breath with Joint Drive Attack and Distant Storm in like a 2 cooldown special, right? At that point, they're getting 10 attack, they're getting 10 more attack, and then once their special triggers, provided there isn't any guard effects present, they're then able to deal out more damage. And while there are also units in a different class who can't take advantage of seals like Steady Breath, units like Valentine Pala are able to attack for the lower of the defense and res on the foe, meaning they could also have an easier time taking out foes. Even if they aren't able to consistently trigger 2 cooldown specials, they still have that advantage. So it's not necessarily, there isn't necessarily a set in stone like best when it comes to this role, but rather the role itself is the best when it comes to using Distant Storm. And 3 other examples that come to mind are Lex, Levitane, and Swordheart, or Sword Reinhardt. Now you'll probably be asking why I didn't put someone like Arden or Finn on the list despite both of them having dual phase Brave. I think it's important to note that those 2 units rely on being within a certain HP threshold, and if they didn't have that HP threshold, then I probably would have put them on the list, but due to the fact that Distant Storm chips away damage every single combat, Finn and Arden are not really good users of it. And beyond that, Arden is more built for a near save role anyway, rather than a Vantage tank, because of the fact that Arden has lopsided defenses, which works, again, for his near save capabilities. However, when it comes to just general distant counter Vantage, I still believe that he has too much defense, where I believe he doesn't have the ability to set up Vantage reliably against melee foes, and he's taking too much damage from mages or enemies that target his res to the point where he's going to fall out of the 50% range. It's too strict despite the fact that he has a lot of HP. And while Finn does have a more lenient HP threshold, the fact that he has an HP threshold in the first place is already a detriment because of the fact that he is going to lose DPS if he falls below 25% HP. And the more combats he decides to enter, the more likely he's going to fall below that 25% HP threshold, which is why I have Lex on this list over Finn. Finn, I believe, despite having a dual-phase Brave weapon, is better suited for the player phase because of the fact that he has all this speed. He doesn't really have the best bulk, and while Lex and Finn do have the same magical bulk, Lex doesn't lose out on as much attack as Finn does if they fall below 25% HP, which is why I do think Lex makes for a better Vantage unit over Finn. However, you could also argue that Lex isn't necessarily the best Vantage unit anyway, but he still has that niche. And outside of units with dual-phase Brave, there are also units that have Sustain. So for example, Legendary Seliph, Winter Ephraim, and Brave Ephraim. They all have Sustain. Legendary Seliph can heal HP per attack he lands on the foe, and because his weapon relies on him being below 100% HP, it's actually really synergetic with his weapon. So Distance Storm will always keep him below 100% HP, on top of the fact that he will just be getting more attack, and it will allow him to take out foes more consistently. Meanwhile, with Winter Ephraim, his weapon actually does function on having more attack than the foe, so he can get his enemy phase Brave, which is great. And because his weapon heals after combat for 7 HP, he can actually maintain a relatively decent amount of HP after combat, provided that he doesn't take too much damage. But if you're running a Hardy Fighter set like on screen, then it won't be that much of an issue. However, I also don't think Winter Ephraim is necessarily the best Vantage unit anyway, because he also has that HP condition of 25%. And while that is still technically lenient, I still don't think it's worth the effort, especially considering the fact that A, he would still need to set up, and if you are to keep him within the Vantage range consistently, you have to run other skills that provide chip damage. And then for a similar reason to Legendary Seliph, Brave Ephraim also has healing per hit during combat. However, you could also argue that he's better off as a near save unit, but if you want to use him for general just tanking or killing or whatever, you can still do it with Distance Storm and Brave Ephraim because he does have the ability to heal and maintain a consistent HP threshold. And other units with Sustain that are worthwhile options are Malkana and Forsyth. Malkana also heals after combat for 7 HP, and he can actually make use of this skill really well, considering the fact that he also has access to Dragon's Wrath and his infantry, so he can use Steady Breath and always retaliate with 2 cooldown specials. So in this set, it's definitely expensive. There's so many expensive skills, I get that. But this is definitely when as far as Distance Storm is concerned, this is definitely his best kit, in my opinion. Where he takes a bit of damage, he reduces it because of Dragon's Wrath, he retaliates with a Glimmer, or whatever 2 cooldown special you want to run on him, and he ends up doing a lot more because Distance Storm provides extra attack, Dragon's Wrath also provides extra attack, Joint Drive Attack, so on and so forth. Steady Breath also really helps, and he also just becomes a massive staple because Dust Dragonstone provides 8 to everything. Meanwhile, if you want to run Forsyth as a general tank and nuke or whatever, you can also run him with Distance Storm because of the fact that his weapon heals 10 HP per hit, which is, if I remember correctly, the most out of all the units during combat. So it shouldn't be a problem for him to keep his sustainability, especially as an armor with that kind of mixed bulk. He really shouldn't have too much of an issue using Distance Storm. And then finally, the units that rely on one-hit KOs, there are plenty of them that can actually use it fairly well. One of the most notable examples is definitely Brave Marth, who has his Shining Emblem niche and has innate Vantage, provided that his conditions are all met. He'll be able to always spam Shining Emblem in the enemy phase, provided that there isn't any Hardy Bearing present. But even so, Distance Storm will allow him to secure one-hit KOs much more consistently, especially with Joint Drive Attack and a seal that increases his attack. Meanwhile, Moosebow is a fantastic option as well because of the fact that Domain of Flame provides an exuberant amount of attack to the user. And you can also pair this up with any other Distance Storm unit if you want to, because of the fact that it's a joint drive effect. But yes, Moosebow will hit really hard, especially with Domain of Flame, so he definitely makes for a decent one-hit KO unit. And then of course there's also Levitate, who also has her super hard hitting PRF, who also relies on one-hit KOs. And because she also functions fairly well in the enemy phase, she's definitely a notable option when it comes to using Distance Storm. Now when it comes to other Vantage units, you have young Caeda, you have Fina, and you also have young Marth. Young Caeda is definitely one of the more notable ones because of the fact that her PRF just has innate advantage. She has a good speed stat, so if there's matchups against units such as Brave Arm who could prevent follow-up attacks with wind sweep skills, for example, she can always stack up her speed and then retaliate with a vantage hit and should be able to kill on the first hit because of the sword effectiveness. You also have other special spamming heroes similar to Brave Marth, where we have Fina and Young Marth. Basically, they'll be doing the same thing. They have innate advantage. They can run Distant Storm, spam 2 cooldown specials, and hit really, really hard because they're always going to be triggering that special as long as it's set up initially. And then, of course, you also have Eldigan and Ares, who have their Dark Mistletoe effect, where they have special spiral and slaying in their weapon. They get extra attack and defense from their weapon. So Distant Storm Bonfire spam will just do a lot of damage in general. And even though they're still relying on one-hit KOs, they still do a fairly decent job, especially with Distant Storm. However, definitely when you compare them to like Young Marth or Fina, for example, or even Young Caeda, who can speed stack and avoid damage reduction skills, for example, they definitely do a better job. However, they're definitely notable options nonetheless. And as far as I'm concerned, these are the best users of Distant Storm. I looked through a bunch of units to see if I could find any other standout ones. Obviously, Winter Altina and Altina don't need them because of the fact that they have a DC PRF, so they weren't counted for anyone wondering. But outside of that, I feel like these are definitely the best Distant Storm users that we have. So if you're looking to give Distant Storm to a unit that you want to function way better in the enemy phase, I would consider any of these options listed. If you have any other ones that I may have missed or I should have considered as well, let me know down below. I just wanted to get my thoughts out here because I do think this is definitely worth discussing, especially when there's only so many like notable options when it comes to just using Distant Storm. So while it definitely has its benefits, it can definitely hurt other units in the long run because of the fact that it does wear their health down. But even so, let me know what you think down below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.